On a cold winter morning, Clara and her daughter Julia were abruptly woken up by loud knocks on the door of the small house where they lived. It was the owner, Mr. Alberto, a man known for his coldness and rigidity when it came to business. Clara, fighting the anxiety that was already consuming her days, opened the door, hoping it was just another warning, a reminder of the late rent she could no longer pay. However, Alberto's hard countenance left no room for illusions. "You've had enough time, Clara. I can't wait any longer," he said bluntly. "You guys need to leave today." The words weighed like a sentence, and Clara felt her world fall apart at that moment. Clara tried to argue, begging for more time, explaining that after her husband's death and the loss of her job, things had become unbearably difficult. She was looking for work and promised that as soon as she got something, she would pay the back rent. Julia, her 7-year-old daughter, watched the conversation with wide eyes, feeling the tension in the air, although she did not fully understand the gravity of the situation. For her, that house was the only home she knew, and the thought of losing everything seemed frightening. But Alberto's heart was hardened by years of distrust and emotional detachment. "Business is business, Clara," he replied coldly. "If you can't pay, you can't stay. I have other tenants waiting for this place." With no other choice, Clara began to gather her things in silence, with her heart sinking and her hands shaking. There was nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The city was large, but it seemed completely indifferent to her and her daughter's suffering. While Clara folded Julia's clothes and put them in an old suitcase, she tried to hold back her tears so as not to worry the girl even more. Little Julia, confused, asked in a low voice, "Mommy, where are we going now?" Clara looked at her daughter and, without knowing how to respond, just hugged her, trying to convey a strength that not even she herself felt. The day was dark for both of them. Clara and Julia were forced to leave the house they knew as home, with only a few belongings. Mr. Alberto, impassive, closed the door behind them, not caring what would happen next. They wandered the streets, without a certain destination, carrying the weight of an uncertain future. Each step they took felt heavier than the last, as if the ground was crumbling beneath their feet. Clara could barely imagine how she would start her life over again, but she knew she needed to find a way to protect her daughter, to give her a new chance. As they walked through the icy streets, Clara began to reflect on how her life had changed so drastically in such a short time. A year earlier, she had a stable home, a loving husband, and a relatively peaceful life. Now it was just her and Julia, alone, aimless. The future that once seemed clear had become a blur. Mr. Alberto, on the other hand, returned to his comfortable life without remorse or guilt. For him, Clara was just another defaulting tenant among so many other cases he had faced over the years. What he didn't know was that destiny was just beginning to weave an unexpected story. As time passed, the image of Clara and Julia disappeared from Alberto's mind. To him, that incident meant nothing more than a necessary act to keep his estate profitable. He never thought about that woman or her daughter again, assuming that, like so many others, they had found somewhere else to live. However, what he didn't know was that the world goes around and that, sometimes, those we consider insignificant or disposable can return in ways we would never imagine. In the days following their expulsion, Clara and Julia faced the worst winter of their lives. With nowhere to go, they spent a few nights in overcrowded shelters, where conditions were precarious and the environment at times hostile. Clara, who had never experienced such a desperate situation, tried to maintain her dignity and hope, but each new day made this effort more difficult. Julia's face, pale and tired, reflected the growing fear that life on the streets would become permanent. Clara knew she needed to find a quick solution, but the doors of the job market seemed closed to a woman like her. No recent experience, no contacts, no luck. Over time, however, Clara's resilience began to bear fruit. One afternoon of pure desperation, while walking down a shopping street, she noticed a small advertisement pasted in the window of a local cafe. They were hiring kitchen help. Despite being a low-paying job, it was an opportunity to get back on his feet. Clara entered the cafe with her heart racing and, after a brief conversation with the manager, got the job. It was the first sigh of relief he'd felt in weeks. From that moment on, she knew that, even if the road was long, there was a chance to build something new for herself and Julia. The first months were tough. The salary Clara received was barely enough to cover her basic needs and, for a time, they continued to live in shelters. Still, the work routine gave Clara a new sense of purpose. Little by little, with a lot of discipline and sacrifice, she managed to save enough money to rent a small room in a modest boarding house. It was a cramped place with no privacy, but for Clara and Julia, it seemed like a palace compared to the streets. The feeling of having a roof over their heads again was an immeasurable relief. Julia, always by her mother's side, began to smile a little more, relieved to know that, at least for now, they were safe. Julia, despite all the turbulence, showed admirable strength. Little by little, Clara managed to enroll her back in school, and the girl, who had always been intelligent and curious, quickly stood out among her classmates. Even with the difficulties, Julia was grateful for every small achievement, and this gave Clara strength. The mother, seeing her daughter's growth and perseverance, felt more determined than ever to continue fighting. For Clara, the dream of giving Julia a better life was what kept her going on the most difficult days. She knew the future would be challenging, but she was willing to sacrifice everything to ensure her daughter had opportunities she herself never had. Over the years, Clara gained confidence and experience. At the cafe, she began taking on more responsibilities and was eventually promoted to shift manager. This progress, although slow, allowed her to start dreaming of greater financial stability. Still living in modest conditions, Clara never stopped dreaming of the day when she could provide Julia with a real home. A home that wasn't at the mercy of cold owners like Alberto, who only saw people for the numbers they represented. At the same time, Julia grew up full of ambition. Inspired by her mother's sacrifice, she dedicated herself intensely to her studies, always looking for ways to stand out. From an early age, she knew that education was her key to a better future, and she promised herself that she would do everything she could to repay her mother for all the effort and love she had received. While Clara worked tirelessly to support them, Julia dedicated herself to building a bright future. What they didn't know, however, was that destiny was in store for a twist that would change their lives forever. Years passed, and the name Alberto rarely crossed Clara's mind. She had buried that painful memory somewhere deep in her memory, too busy with the challenges of the present. Alberto, in turn, continued his life, without ever imagining that the woman he had once put on the street was about to return in a surprising way. What was to come would reveal that time, in its unpredictable form, can change everything. The years passed quickly, and both Clara and Julia followed paths marked by sacrifices and achievements. Julia, driven by her mother's strength and dedication, continued to excel in her studies, winning scholarships and opportunities that many would consider unattainable. Clara, in turn, finally managed to stabilize her finances, which allowed them both to leave the modest boarding house and move to a small, simple but cozy apartment. Over time, the dream of a better life became reality. Still, the past of struggles, difficulties, and the memory of the day they were put on the street by Alberto never completely disappeared. Julia, now a determined young adult, decided that she would pursue a career in the field of law. During the difficult times, she had promised herself that she would do everything she could to help people like her and her mother, vulnerable people who faced unfair and inhumane situations like the one they suffered years ago. With her unremitting efforts, she managed to graduate with honors and was quickly hired by a renowned law firm. Clara, proud of her daughter, saw in Julia the fulfillment of all the sacrifice she made throughout her life. She felt that, finally, the difficulties of the past were being overcome. Meanwhile, Alberto's life continued practically unchanged. He maintained his real estate empire, always concerned about contracts, tenants, and the profit these properties brought. For him, everything was a matter of numbers, and people were just details that served his financial interests. Clara's name was nothing more than a vague memory in his mind, lost among so many other tenants he had evicted over the years. Alberto, now older and even more hardened by life, could never have imagined that fate was about to bring him face to face with the consequences of his past actions. It was then that the unexpected happened. One day, Julia received a new case in her office, a request to defend tenants who were being threatened with eviction. The situation was complicated, as the property owner alleged constant delays in payments and demanded a quick and definitive solution. The name of the owner, however, awakened something in Julia. Upon seeing the name Alberto Silva on the documents, long-buried memories emerged. She immediately remembered the man who, so many years ago, had put her and her mother out on the street. The man who, without remorse, threw them out into the cold, without offering them a second chance. At first, Julia was in shock. The past and the present had crossed in an almost surreal way. She thought about the irony of the situation. Now, she was the one with the power to confront Alberto, this time on the side of justice. However, Julia did not act on impulse. She knew that, as a lawyer, her duty was to protect her clients, not seek personal revenge. But as he reviewed the documents and prepared for the case, he realized that fate had placed this opportunity in his hands for a greater reason. This wasn't just about justice for those tenants, but a chance to close a cycle that had begun with so much suffering. When telling Clara about the case, Julia noticed her mother's distant look, which, for a moment, seemed to relive all the trauma of that fateful day. Clara, however, smiled softly and said, "I knew the world would turn around. I just never imagined it would happen like this." For Clara, seeing her daughter in a position of strength and about to confront the man who once emotionally destroyed them was a victory in itself. But Clara also knew that true victory was not in revenge, but in justice. She trusted Julia to do what was right, not just for them, but for everyone who suffered similar abuse. On the day of the hearing, Julia entered the courtroom with confidence. On the other side, sitting among his lawyers, was Alberto. He barely looked at Julia, without recognizing the brilliant young woman in front of him. To him, it was just another eviction case, a legal battle that, like so many others, he was confident he would win. However, what he didn't know was that, on the other side of the room, was the daughter of the woman he had evicted years before, the woman he never thought of meeting again. At that moment, fate was about to complete its cycle. Julia, with years of dedication and hard work, was ready to face the man who had once been responsible for one of the darkest moments of her life. The difference now was that, unlike when she was a scared child with no options, Julia now had control of the situation. She was ready to do justice, but what Alberto didn't yet know was that the reunion would be more transformative than he could ever imagine. The court was silent as Julia prepared her arguments. On the other side, Alberto, always arrogant and confident, impatiently awaited the start of the trial. He saw that process as just another bureaucratic hurdle, nothing he couldn't resolve with his lawyers and his fortune. For him, those tenants were nothing more than numbers, and Julia, a young lawyer, didn't seem like a threat. Little did he know that fate had placed before him the daughter of the woman he evicted years ago, and that now that same daughter had the chance to change the course of their lives. Julia took a deep breath before starting her presentation. When he looked at Alberto, he felt a mix of emotions. He didn't recognize her, but for Julia, that man represented years of suffering, not just hers, but that of her mother. However, she knew that what was driving her at that moment was not revenge. She had a duty to justice to those who, like her and Clara, had been harmed by a ruthless system and by men like Alberto. With a firm stance, he began to explain the case. He showed the judge the numerous irregularities in the rental contracts and how Alberto had repeatedly exploited the tenants, abusing his position of power. As Julia spoke, Alberto began to pay more attention. Something in her voice, in the determination with which she presented the facts, seemed familiar to him, but he couldn't identify where. When Julia mentioned previous eviction cases, citing, without directly accusing him, the abuse of power that many landlords practiced against vulnerable tenants, a faint memory began to emerge in Alberto's mind. Was it possible that she was one of the many people he had evicted in the past? Still, he couldn't make the exact connection. While Julia spoke, Alberto's lawyers tried to intervene, but she was prepared. "I knew that, in addition to exposing the illegalities of the current case, I needed to show a pattern of behavior. And, to that end, he spared no details about Alberto's inhumane practices over the years. With each new piece of evidence, Alberto's stance changed. The man who previously felt secure in his position of power now began to realize that he was facing someone much more prepared than he imagined. At that moment, the judge asked for a break, and it was then that Alberto, uncomfortable with the way things were going, finally approached Julia. "You speak as if you know me," he said, with a slight tone of disdain. Julia looked at him, holding his gaze firmly. "I know you, Mr. Alberto," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "Many years ago, you put my mother and I out on the street, without an ounce of compassion. I was just a child, but I never forgot that day." Alberto stepped back slightly, surprised. The revelation hit him like an unexpected blow. In that instant, he remembered. The woman with a young daughter, evicted in the middle of winter. It was her. Alberto was paralyzed for a few seconds, not knowing how to react. He never imagined that that defenseless girl would become a lawyer who now confronted him with so much courage. The weight of the past hit him overwhelmingly, but he still tried to pull himself together. "It's business," he said, trying to justify his actions. "There is no room for sentimentality." But deep down, something in his face showed that he knew this wasn't a simple matter of contracts. Julia, now more confident than ever, smiled softly. "Business? Maybe that's how you see people. But for me and my mother, that day was the hardest day of our lives. What you didn't understand, Mr. Alberto, is that people are not just numbers. And today, I'm here not for revenge, but to ensure that others don't go through what we went through." There was strength and calm in his words, and everyone in the room felt the weight of that moment. When the trial resumed, Julia presented her closing arguments. Her goal was not to destroy Alberto, but to bring justice to the tenants who, like her and her mother, had suffered from his indifference. The judge, impressed by the clarity and depth of the facts presented, seemed to favor Julia's cause. Alberto, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. For the first time in years, he was confronted with the human consequences of his cold, calculating actions. At the end of the trial, the verdict was clear. The tenants would not be evicted, and Alberto was ordered to pay significant compensation for his abusive practices. But the biggest impact was not on the money. For Alberto, that trial was the moment his life began to change. He, who had spent so many years believing that power was within his possession, now saw the strength of someone he once considered insignificant. Alberto left the court in silence. Julia's words echoed in his mind as he walked down the busy street, now without the usual arrogance that always accompanied him. Throughout his life, Alberto believed that power came from the control he exercised over others. Being a property owner, deciding people's fate through contracts and rents, has always given him a sense of security. However, after that trial, he began to realize something he had never considered: the human impact of his decisions. For the first time, he was forced to face the lives he had affected. While returning home, Alberto couldn't get Julia out of his mind. The memory of her and Clara, that mother and daughter he had evicted years ago, emerged with painful clarity. At the time, he had barely thought about the consequences of his actions. Clara was just a tenant who hadn't been able to pay her rent, and for him, the eviction was a simple matter of business. However, now he found himself confronted with the truth. That decision, which he had made coldly and indifferently, had shaped the future of two people in a way he had never imagined. At home, Alberto sat in his office and looked around. The walls were adorned with diplomas, certificates, and documents celebrating his long career as a successful businessman. But at that moment, they felt empty. None of these achievements carried the same meaning as before. Instead, he found himself haunted by the decisions he had made over the years. How many other families had he put on the street? How many times had he prioritized profit over compassion? The weight of these questions began to weigh on him in a way he had never experienced before. Days passed, and Alberto continued to be immersed in his thoughts. The figure of Julia, now a successful lawyer, reminded him of how unpredictable life could be. The girl he had despised in the past had now defied him and defeated him, not with hatred, but with justice. This disturbed him deeply. He expected revenge, he expected resentment, but he found a woman who, despite everything, still remained ethical and balanced. This made him reflect on himself. What if he had acted differently back then? What if he had shown a little compassion? Maybe your life would be different now. Deep down, Alberto began to realize that the money and power he had accumulated did not bring him the satisfaction he expected. He had everything he ever wanted: property, respect in the business world, influence. But at that moment, everything seemed superficial. The lives of Clara and Julia, which he thought he had forgotten, came back with overwhelming force. He wondered how Clara was now. Had she managed to rebuild her life? Would Julia have had the same strength to get where she was if it weren't for the difficulties he imposed? The restlessness he felt gave him no peace. One night, unable to sleep, Alberto got up and, without thinking much, began to write a letter. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, but I felt like I needed to do something. The words came out with difficulty, as it was rare for him to express any kind of regret or remorse. But throughout the letter, Alberto admitted his guilt and acknowledged the suffering he had caused. He wrote about how the court encounter had made him rethink his life and his choices. He asked for forgiveness, even without knowing whether Clara or Julia would accept it. The letter, addressed to Clara, remained on the table for a few days. Alberto wasn't sure if he should send it. He had never apologized to anyone in his life, least of all to those he saw as just tenants. However, there was something inside him that drove him to continue. He knew that if he wanted any kind of redemption, this was the first step. Finally, in a burst of courage, Alberto sent the letter. I didn't know what to expect. Maybe Clara and Julia never read it, or if they did, maybe they simply ignored it. However, he felt it was something that needed to be done. It was his attempt to close a cycle, to try to correct, even if minimally, a mistake from the past. Now all that was left was to wait. Days after sending the letter, Alberto lived in a state of silent anxiety. Each morning, as he checked his mail or email, he waited for a response, even though he knew it might never come. The weight of regret followed him like a constant shadow, something he couldn't shake. For the first time, Alberto saw himself faced with his own failures, not as a cold and calculating businessman, but as a human being who had damaged lives with his indifference. And, even if he tried to focus on his business, something in his mind always came back to that day in court, to Julia's steady gaze and the memory of Clara. Meanwhile, Clara received the letter unexpectedly. It was an ordinary day, and she had no idea that something so impactful would be waiting in the mailbox. When he saw the sender, his heart quickened. It had been many years since she had thought of Alberto often. She had tried in every way to move on. But his name, that man who had thrown them out on the street without any consideration, still awakened bitter memories. Reluctantly, Clara opened the envelope, not knowing exactly what to expect. When she started reading, Clara was overcome by a mix of emotions. At first, disbelief overwhelmed her. Alberto, that implacable man, was asking for forgiveness? His words, written with disconcerting honesty, touched her in a way she hadn't expected. He admitted his mistakes, acknowledged the suffering he had caused, and frankly apologized for what he had done. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. It was a letter she would never have imagined receiving, but at the same time, it was the letter she always needed, without knowing it. Clara sat in her favorite armchair, reread the letter several times, pondering what she felt. The immediate impulse was anger, the pain of so many years being relived on a piece of paper. However, there was something deeper that was beginning to emerge. Upon reading Alberto's words, Clara realized that this was not the same person who had kicked her out of the house years ago. There was genuine regret there, and, as she reflected on everything she had experienced since then, the strength she and Julia had shown to rebuild their lives, Clara began to consider what forgiveness meant. She knew that if she maintained her bitterness and resentment, she would be trapping a part of herself in that past. And Clara, above all, wanted freedom. She had dedicated her life to ensuring that Julia had the best possible future, and in the process, She had healed from many of the wounds that Alberto had caused. Now, after everything, Clara realized that perhaps the forgiveness was not for Alberto's benefit, but for her own. It would be his way of completely freeing himself from that painful history. Still, it wouldn't be an easy decision. Clara knew that forgiving Alberto meant facing the past again and revisiting that pain. She thought about Julia, about everything her daughter had achieved, and how the suffering they faced had made them stronger. Clara knew that Julia was capable of moving forward without holding on to the hurt. But what about her? How could I deal with this offer of repentance that Alberto was extending? After much reflection, Clara decided that she needed to share the letter with Julia. That night, while they were both at home, Clara called her daughter to talk. "I received a letter today," Clara began, while Julia looked at her, curious. "It's from Alberto." The surprise on Julia's face was evident.
¿Alberto?
"The man who evicted us." Clara nodded and calmly handed the letter to her daughter. Julia read the letter in silence, and Clara watched her daughter's expressions change as she took in each word. When she finished, Julia sighed deeply and looked at her mother. "He's asking for forgiveness." "Mom," said Julia, almost in disbelief. "I know," Clara replied. "The question now is, what are we going to do with it?" For Julia, the decision to forgive or not seemed clear. She knew how much she had fought to overcome that past and, deep down, she had already learned to leave the hurt behind. However, she knew the process was different for her mother, who had suffered more directly and carried the responsibility of protecting her during the most difficult years. "I think forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves, Mother," said Julia with an understanding look. "Maybe it's time to free ourselves from this past." Clara, touched by her daughter's wisdom, realized that Julia was right. It was time to finally let go of the weight I was carrying and allow life to take its course. They had won after all. Now, the real victory would be to find peace. In the days following the conversation with Julia, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the decision to forgive Alberto. The letter, although unexpected, had moved her deeply, awakening feelings that, until then, had been buried in the past. For years, she believed that moving on meant ignoring the pain he caused. However, now Clara found herself faced with a new possibility, that of confronting this pain definitively and perhaps, for the first time, truly freeing herself from it. As she pondered what to do, Clara realized that, in many ways, she had already healed from her deepest wounds. The journey that she and Julia walked together, from the eviction to Julia's success as a lawyer, had been long and full of challenges. But despite everything, they had emerged stronger. Julia, with her wisdom and maturity, was always a reflection of the resilience that Clara nurtured in silence. Now, however, Clara understood that forgiveness was the last link that needed to be broken so that both could, in fact, move forward without any trace of the past. After days of reflection, Clara finally made her decision. She felt it was not just an emotional choice, but also a spiritual one. The act of forgiving Alberto would be, above all, a personal liberation. With a lighter heart, Clara decided that she needed to meet him, eye to eye, so that forgiveness had the real meaning she was looking for. She knew that writing a letter or giving an indirect answer wouldn't be enough. She needed to confront him, just as she had confronted her own pain over the years. Julia supported her mother's decision, although she suggested caution. She knew that meeting Alberto could be emotionally difficult for Clara, but she also understood how important this moment of closure would be. Julia, with her rational and mature perspective, recognized that, no matter how painful the experience was, Clara had the necessary strength to deal with the past directly. "I'm with you, Mother," said Julia, seeing the determination in Clara's eyes. "I believe you are doing the right thing." Clara then tried to find out how to find Alberto. It wasn't difficult. His name was still associated with local real estate deals, and she soon got his contact. After hesitating for a few minutes, she took a deep breath and made the call. Alberto answered with a tired but still firm voice, like someone who hadn't expected to hear news from someone who had impacted his life for a long time. When Clara identified herself, there was silence on the other end of the line. "Clara?" he repeated, surprised. Her name seemed loaded with memories he preferred not to relive. "Yes, it's me," she replied calmly. "I got your letter, and I think we should meet." The idea of a meeting made Alberto uneasy. He didn't expect Clara to want to talk to him in person, much less be willing to listen to his plea for forgiveness. However, there was something in her tone that made him realize that this moment was inevitable. "Of course," he replied after a brief pause. "When and where?" Clara suggested that they meet in a discreet cafe in the city center, a neutral place where they could talk without distractions or interference. On the appointed day, Clara arrived at the cafe with a racing heart, but with a calm mind. He sat at a table in the corner, waiting for Alberto. A few minutes later, he entered. The man she saw was very different from the one years ago. Alberto was aged, with slightly hunched shoulders and a tired expression. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now seemed to carry a mixture of regret and tiredness. As he approached Clara, he hesitated for a moment before sitting down opposite her. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice low and a little shaky. Clara watched him for a moment, searching for the right words. "I received your letter, Alberto," she began directly, "and I confess it was difficult for me. For many years I thought I would never hear those words from you." Alberto lowered his eyes, feeling the weight of his actions, but Clara continued. "What you did caused me a lot of pain, and I won't deny that. But now, after everything I've experienced, I believe that holding on to this hurt won't help me move forward." Alberto raised his head, his eyes filled with regret. "I was wrong, Clara," he said. "I don't know if I can justify my actions, but I was a man obsessed with power, with money. I never cared about the lives I harmed, and that cost me dearly in many ways." Clara nodded, understanding. She was not there to judge, but to free herself. "Alberto, I don't know what you've been through, but I'm here to tell you that I forgive you," Clara said, her voice firm but gentle. "Not because of what you did, but because I need peace. My daughter and I have moved on, and now you need to too." The silence that followed was heavy, but also freeing. Alberto, visibly moved, nodded, unable to contain the tears that were beginning to run down his face. For Clara, that moment was the end of a cycle. She felt a deep sense of relief, as if a weight she had been carrying for years had finally been left behind. The meeting between Clara and Alberto in the cafe marked the end of a long and painful journey, but also the beginning of something new. When leaving that place, Clara felt a lightness that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Forgiving Alberto not only healed a deep wound, but also opened space so that she and Julia could continue their lives without the shadows of the past. It was as if, finally, a door had been closed, allowing the future to be faced differently, with more freedom and hope. In the days that followed, Clara noticed subtle changes in the way she saw the world. The emotional weight that once tied her to the past had disappeared, giving way to a new perspective. She felt grateful for everything she had achieved over the years, but most of all, she felt at peace with herself. For the first time, Clara was able to look back and see her own strength, not just the pain she endured. Every sacrifice, every tear shed, had shaped her into the resilient woman she was now. Julia, seeing her mother return from that meeting so calmly, also felt relieved. She knew how much that story had affected them, even after years of success and overcoming. Clara was always an inspiration to Julia, but seeing her mother face her past in such a courageous way further reinforced the respect and admiration she felt for her. "I'm proud of you, Mom," said Julia, on a quiet afternoon as they had coffee together. "It couldn't have been easy, but you did what many people can't." Clara smiled, grateful for her daughter's constant support. "I did this for us, Julia, because we deserve the peace we fought so hard to achieve." While Clara and Julia followed their routines, something unexpected happened. Alberto also began to change. The encounter with Clara had left deep marks on him. The letter he sent was just the first step in his attempt at redemption, but the forgiveness he received from Clara made him rethink many of his life choices. For the first time, Alberto realized that the power and money he had accumulated over the years had not brought him the satisfaction he had expected. He began to question his priorities, to reflect on the lives he had negatively impacted and on what really mattered. Determined to do something with this new awareness, Alberto began to distance himself from the business practices that made him rich, but that, at the same time, distanced him from humanity. He sold some of his properties and, with the money, began to invest in social projects, seeking to repair the harm he had caused over the years. One of the first initiatives it financed was a shelter for vulnerable families, offering not only financial support, but also educational and emotional support. It was his way of trying to redeem himself, of turning the pain he had caused into something positive for other people. Time passed, and Alberto's name began to be associated with social causes, a radical contrast to the relentless man he used to be. He knew he could never fully erase what he had done, but he was determined to live the rest of his life with a different purpose. Clara, upon hearing about the changes in Alberto's life, felt calm. The forgiveness he offered had had a greater effect than she could have imagined, and it only reinforced her belief that sometimes compassion was more powerful than any punishment. For Julia, seeing Alberto's transformation also brought a sense of closure. She no longer harbored anger or resentment toward the man who one day kicked them out of the house. On the contrary, I admired the path he was trying to follow. People can change, Julia told her mother in a conversation. And I think what you did helped transform his life. Clara, ever humble, replied, Maybe, but he chose this path. Sometimes all we need is a second chance. As the months passed, Clara and Julia continued to build their lives, now free from any ties to their painful past. Julia, in her legal career, became a fervent defender of the rights of the most vulnerable, inspired by the story she lived with her mother. She knew that many people, like Clara, faced injustice every day, and she was determined to fight to make those voices heard. Clara, in turn, found a new purpose in the tranquility of the present. The relationship between mother and daughter, strengthened by so many challenges, continued to be the foundation on which they built their dreams and their future. Now, without the burden of resentment and pain, Clara and Julia knew that what really mattered was what they built together. A life based on empathy, resilience, and, above all, the ability to forgive and move on. Time passed, and Clara and Julia's lives continued to flourish. The peace brought by forgiveness allowed both to live fully, without the emotional ties that previously tied them to the past. Clara, who dedicated so many years of her life to caring for Julia and overcoming the challenges they faced together, now lived with renewed serenity. She could finally enjoy the fruits of her labor and her daughter's achievements, without the constant shadow of the trauma Alberto had caused. Forgiveness had freed not only Clara, but also Julia, who, upon seeing her mother at peace, also felt that a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Julia, in her career, prospered. She became a renowned lawyer, known for her dedication to social causes and the empathy with which she dealt with her clients. For her, the past that marked her so much had become a source of motivation. Each case she took on, especially those involving social injustices, was an opportunity to make a difference and ensure that other vulnerable people did not go through what she and her mother faced. Her life story had become a driving force, and it guided her in every professional decision she made. Clara, in turn, began to dedicate herself to activities that she previously did not have the time or energy to explore. She got involved in community projects and, inspired by Julia's work, began helping women in vulnerable situations, sharing her own story of overcoming. Clara discovered that telling her story was a powerful way to empower other women, showing that, despite obstacles, it was possible to rise again and find new paths. She became a beloved figure in her community, someone who was looked to for advice and support. At an event organized by the local community, Clara was invited to give a talk about resilience and overcoming. Sitting in front of an audience that included women facing challenges similar to those she had previously faced, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that brought her here. She began her speech by remembering the day she was evicted with Julia, detailing the pain and despair she felt. But, as she told the story, Clara also highlighted the moments of strength, the sacrifices she made, and how, despite everything, she and Julia managed to get back on their feet. "I learned that forgiveness is not something you just give to others," Clara said. her voice firm but full of emotion. Forgiveness is something you give yourself. When we carry hurt and resentment, we are stuck in the past, with no room for good things to grow in our lives. Forgiving Alberto was, yes, important for me, but above all, it was a way of freeing myself from what held me back. And this freedom allowed me to build a new life, a life full of meaning. Upon finishing her speech, Clara received a standing ovation. The power of her words deeply touched those who were present, especially the women who were still struggling to find their own paths. Julia, who was in the audience, watched with pride. For her, seeing her mother not only overcome difficulties, but also inspire others to do the same, was one of the greatest rewards she could receive. As Clara and Julia continued to grow and prosper, the impact of forgiveness extended beyond them. Alberto, transformed by his own process of redemption, continued his work on social causes. He would never forget the forgiveness Clara had offered him, and it motivated him to do more to right the wrongs of his past. Little by little, he became a respected figure in the field of supporting vulnerable families, using his fortune no longer to accumulate property, but to offer a dignified life to those in need. Alberto and Clara met again on a few occasions, always respectfully, but without reopening old wounds. That cycle had been closed. What was left now were lives that had followed different paths, but that were, in some ways, linked by a shared transformation, the power of forgiveness and redemption. With life in full swing, Clara and Julia knew that they would still face challenges, like anyone else. But now, equipped with the wisdom of the past and the emotional freedom that forgiveness brought, they were ready for whatever the future held. The cycle of pain that once imprisoned them had been broken, and in its place, a legacy of resilience, love, and overcoming flourished. Over the years, Clara and Julia continued to follow paths marked by personal and professional achievements. Past experience had shaped them both in ways that, although painful, made them stronger, more determined, and, above all, more empathetic. The forgiveness Clara offered Alberto not only freed his soul, but also opened doors to new opportunities and a future full of promise. Now, with the past resolved, mother and daughter were free to dream of something bigger, of a future that reflected the strength and resilience they had cultivated over the years. Julia, now a renowned lawyer, began to expand her work. After years of dedicating herself to social causes, she decided to open her own office specializing in human rights and defense of vulnerable tenants. Her goal was to make sure no one else went through what she and her mother did. The office quickly gained recognition for its humanitarian work, attracting clients from different areas, and Julia became a reference in social justice. She, who was once kicked out of her home with her mother, was now a powerful voice against the injustices of the system. Clara, in turn, found a new meaning for her life. After years of dedication to Julia's career and well-being, she now found herself in a place of balance and gratitude. The work she had started in her community, helping other women in vulnerable situations, grew, and she decided to found an NGO that offered emotional and financial support to families who were on the brink of crisis. Her story of overcoming spread, and Clara was invited to speak at several events about her journey and the importance of forgiveness in rebuilding life. He became a symbol of strength not just for those he served, but for everyone who knew his trajectory. However, the impact of forgiveness did not stop there. The relationship between Clara and Alberto, although never close, became marked by mutual respect. Alberto continued his work supporting social projects, and his involvement with the community grew significantly. He began funding programs that offered temporary housing to homeless families, as well as actively engaging in policies that promoted fair housing reform. The man who had once been ruthless in his dealings now devoted his time to righting the wrongs of his past. And although he knew he could never erase what he did, Alberto found comfort in knowing he could at least make a difference. One afternoon, Clara and Julia, after many years, decided to visit the neighborhood where they lived before being evicted. The streets, buildings, and environment were different, but the weight of memories remained. They walked in silence, reflecting on how far they had come since that dark day. "It seems like a lifetime ago," commented Julia, with a soft smile on her face. Clara agreed, holding her daughter's hand affectionately. "It was. And at the same time, it seems like yesterday. When passing by the old house, where it all began, Clara stopped for a moment and looked at the facade. There was no more pain, just the acceptance that this experience was part of her story, but did not define who she was now. This place didn't defeat us, Clara said with determination. It made us stronger. Julia nodded, knowing that those words summed up exactly what they had experienced. The pain that once hurt them was now part of a chapter overcome, which prepared them for all the triumphs that would come. With the sun beginning to set, the two returned home, no longer with the feeling that they were running away from the past, but with the certainty that, wherever they were, they would always carry with them the resilience and love that brought them together. In difficult times, they knew that the future would still bring challenges, but, armed with the wisdom that forgiveness and experience brought, they were prepared to face them head-on. In the years that followed, Clara and Julia continued to shine, helping other people overcome their own difficulties and find paths of hope. The cycle of pain had been broken, and the future, once uncertain and frightening, was now a blank canvas, ready to be filled with new stories, achievements, and moments of happiness. Life, which had once thrown them into the streets without mercy, now presented them with everything they deserved: peace, purpose, and a bright future.